Thank you, Joe. You always have a way of introducing people that it makes me want to look forward to hearing myself. And I'm invariably disappointed by the end of it. Just had a wonderful encounter with a beautiful person next door who came up to me and said, oh, I've been wanting to meet you so badly. Your images this morning were great. And I said, oh no, you're thinking about Dexter. And this happens to me all the time. I remember speaking at a university once in Wolverhampton, England. And I knew I had blown the speech. It was boring. It had no really substance to it. I hadn't prepared properly. And being my weak self, I positioned myself by the door, hoping that somebody would leave, at least one person would thank me and affirm the speech. And finally, one person did come up, and they were from another university, and a member of faculty says, we're always looking for really good speakers. And we understand that you know so-and-so. Would you invite them? So anyways, a few years ago, I overheard my wife saying to a friend, in the form of a complaint, that I, her husband, in the mornings would touch my keyboard before I would touch her. To which I blurted out, unwisely, that's because the keyboard's more responsive, my dear. So it kind of stuck with me, and so I've tried, and because I rise with the sun usually and go to bed with the sun as well, which makes it difficult the further north I go in the summertime, that I'm trying now to kind of lay in bed a little bit in the morning and read until she wakes up, and then we can have our chat about the day, etc. So earlier this week was one of those mornings. I decided not to get up. I decided to stay in bed, and I went out and got my iPhone, which was plugged in another room, brought it back in, and was reading the news. And my wife wakes up, rolls over, and says, "Good grief, you're on the screen again." And I tried to defend myself, but I'm not playing games. I'm reading the newspaper. And she just turned over, and I could sense her irritation. So I decided I would reach for a hard copy book, partly out of guilt, but also wanted to make noises of turning the pages loudly while she was asleep. So I turned over on my side. The first thing I saw was my Kindle. I knew that wouldn't work. So I reached into the hard copy bookshelf, which kind of had to, move the cobwebs away and scrape the dust off, and look for a book that may have some relevance to this morning. And this is the book I found, Daniel Goleman, The Social Intelligence. And this particular quote that struck me: we are wired to be connected. It's true. There's something within the human DNA that causes us, gives us a desire to belong, to be an insider rather than an outsider. Many years ago, a successful businessman in Japan told me, as I was struggling to build this NGO in a very embryonic NGO culture in Japan, and he said, listen, it's like this. In Japan, you've got these giant moats and walls around the castle. Those are designed not only to keep people out, but if you can get inside, they're designed to keep you in. And the goal is, the challenge is, in Japan, within the business culture, to get inside the castle walls and become an insider rather than an outsider. And so this is part of the human desire, to be connected. I assume almost all of you came by airplane to this conference. Is that correct? Did anybody come by any other means? Particularly those abroad, probably not. You probably all came from airplane. And you want airplane rides to be uneventful. But you're also conscious that you become part of this temporary community. And I was on a flight from Hong Kong to Korea recently. And it was an uneventful journey. In fact, on my flight to Hong Kong, I was woken up by a fight breaking out at the front of the cabin, which was quite unusual. But on the return flight from Hong Kong to Seoul and back to Japan, I noticed that the cabin was unexpectedly noisy. There was just a cackle of conversation going on. Then I sat down in my prescribed seat, and before takeoff, this man came up to me and he explained that the cabin was full of his family members. And there must have been 30 or 40 of them. I mean, it was a packed cabin. And he said that his aunt wanted to sit in my seat. So would I be prepared to swap seats with his aunt? And I said, no, I'm quite comfortable here, thank you very much. I was quite a little bit polite, I was settled in, but he insisted he wasn't going to go away, so I thought, well, for the sake of communal harmony in the cabin, I will change seats. So as I get up and begin to walk back, not only does the aunt race forward several rows, but now there's this musical chairs as the whole cabin is reconfiguring itself. And feeling slightly irritated, I look towards the seat I'm going, and there's a great big uncle sitting there. And I just kind of mumbled out loud, great, they're putting two big guys together. And then the cabin went silent. And they all looked towards the young man who had come to me in the first place, wanting a translation. And all I could hear him say was, two big guys sitting together, and then something in the Korean language, at which the whole cabin laughed and laughed and laughed and thought that was funny. But it was an interesting experience that whole episode was both helped me connect with people, but also made me feel very much the outsider. We long to be connected. This is part of the human DNA. Remember this book? Some of you are not nearly old enough to remember this book, but it's a classic. It altered the way many of us view culture, and not just culture from space travel, culture shock, but culture shock also from as a result of travel through time. And Alvin Toffler, in his book, uses an example of the loss of permanence in society by bringing our attention to a very famous American teenager. Does anybody recall that chapter in the book, if you read it those years ago? She's really famous. And at the time in 1969, well, he wrote this, it was published a bit later, but he cites a moment in this girl's life. She was only 10 years old at that time. But she was quite unusual in that she was only about 12 inches tall, or 30 centimeters tall. Can you figure out who that famous American teenager was? Barbie. Barbie doll. And he used Mattel's most popular toy in the history of the world to illustrate the loss of permanence that we are experiencing in modern society. Barbie, within 10 years of her creation in 1959, had sold millions of copies, the most popular doll ever. But now in 1969, Alvin Toffler tells us in his book, Future Shock, that Mattel Incorporated came out with a new improved Barbie. This new improved Barbie had real eyelashes, had a twist and turn waist, and a boyfriend called Ken. And in fear of ticking off millions of little girls and thousands of little boys, I suppose, around the world, they decided to offer a trade-in allowance on an old Barbie for a new Barbie. I wish Apple would do this with iPhones. They said to all these little owners of Barbie dolls that if you bring your old Barbie along, we'll give you a trade-in allowance, and you can have a new improved Barbie. So all over the world, millions of children marched off to the local toy shop, and they traded in their old Barbie for a new Barbie. And Alvin Toffler points out that what Mattel was doing that they didn't know that they were doing was they were teaching a fundamental lesson to the little children of the 60s of how to be a survivor in the future world. And to be a survivor in the future world, you must lose your sense of permanence. Nothing remains the same. And there's two particular areas of change that are relevant to us within this conference theme. One area of change is technological change, and how that's causing us to redefine the second area of change, and that is the concept of community and society. The Lumiere brothers, I butcher the French language, Joe, so my apologies, but these French inventors of moving pictures, urban legend has it in the late 1800s, they gathered a group of people together in a cafe, and they premiered their first moving picture. And the story goes, and some historians contest that it was quite this dramatic, but so the urban legend goes, that, that as these people sat down in this cafe in Paris, and they showed them for the first time ever a moving picture of a locomotive coming into the station, the Gare du Nord, I think it was, and they had positioned the camera so it looked like the train was coming straight to the camera, that the cafe emptied in panic. Because these people had never seen a moving picture before. And that kind of marks the technological change in terms of the information age, which has brought us to today. Sorry, I got to use this. I'm still on that one, but I need to press that one. Frank Lloyd Wright described television as chewing gum for the eyes. T.S. Eliot said about television, it permits millions of people to listen to the same joke at the same time and yet remain lonely. That was in the 60s. I remember in the 80s when I was involved in youth social work in the UK for an NPO there, we were very concerned about the onslaught of video games from America. These were in the days when the video games came in the form of cassette tapes. Do you remember those? And there were the Atari machines, and there was great concern among many of us that teenage boys particularly were becoming addicted. And so a lot of research was done. We participated in some of that research, and the research actually revealed that there was not a video game addiction problem among male adolescents, but there was among males from the ages of 25 to 40. In other words, the fathers of the boys for whom the video games were being bought were the ones that were becoming addicted. And then we move forward to the modern day, where now parents have a new F word to be frightened of and concerned about: Facebook. And more parents are dealing with having a discussion with their pre-teen children about when they will be allowed to join Facebook. I think the actual stated age is 12 years old. Is that correct? I think you have to be 12 to have a Facebook page. I know of many parents who are allowing their children at 8, 9, or 10 to have a Facebook page and allowing them or giving them permission to lie about their age. But this technological change is causing a redefinition of what a community is. And that our concept of community is changing. Just to kind of illustrate the lenses I look at this subject through, particularly in my adult life, we work with remote rural communities around the world. Laka is a particular village in Ethiopia where a water system is currently being installed. When I think of community, I think of them. When I think of community, I think of Bosnia, where I worked during the war, trying to keep schools open in the city of Mostar, and to see the terrible effects of ethnic cleansing and community being redefined on the basis of both geography and history. I think of well user groups that we form around shallow wells in places like Cambodia. I think of the groups in Tohoku, northern Japan, remote fishing and farming villages who have had the geographical borders of their communities redefined and their social fabric dramatically affected in serious ways. I also think of the new word that was coined on Facebook in March 2011 when in Japan the word for foreigners is gaijin. And on Facebook you began to see this word, flyjin. That was a word used to describe all the foreigners who up and left Japan during that time. It's not a derogatory term, or at least I don't view that group of people in a derogatory way, because we were all under pressures. All of us who were not Japanese nationals, we've chosen to live here. And all of us were having emails, phone calls, Skype messages from family members and friends around the world saying, get out of there fast and feeling we were irresponsible to stay. So I have great sympathy for the many that left. But I also remember the IAFOR conference a few days after, where I think attendance dropped by 70%, approximately, a much smaller crowd. And I remember standing here with Joe and the others from IAFOR with such gratitude that people still came. But it also caused us to look around at each other and say, who stayed? And it redefined our sense of community. So all of these are lenses that I look through. Just as I have no purpose to promote this, but because I'm interested in neglected communities, I love to bicycle, and in May I'm beginning a 6,000-kilometer journey by bicycle around the coastline of Honshu, because I want to discover more about these remote communities that live in what could probably be described as the tsunami zone, because every bit of Japanese coastline is in the tsunami zone, and I'm taking my dog with me. And so we're going to form our own little community as we go exploring around Japan. So when I think about the changing definitions of community, I think of community can be defined historically as a geographical patch. Historically, that's probably what a community is. Now we have generational communities. I wrote a book a few years ago called Boys Becoming Men, which was an exploration of male adolescent development in Western culture and the effects of the absence of a puberty rite of passage. The concept of a nuclear family, the term adolescent, are modern concepts. And as a result, some damage has been done, I believe, to social fabric by such an emphasis on nuclear family at the expense of extended family. Then there's groups of mutual interest. And those are kind of the categories I think of. So on that morning earlier this week, as I was leafing through Goldman's book, trying to be as noisy as I could to show my wife that reading a screen was actually better than reading hard copy, which I don't fully believe, but I was irritated with her. Then I decided, well, I need to reach for another book. So I, again, brushed the dust away, threw the cobwebs, and I brought out one of my theology books, a really heavy book, because I thought maybe I could arouse her sympathy that I was in bed holding up this dictionary and encyclopedia. So the New Dictionary of Christian Ethics and Pastoral Theology, and there I went to the section on society and community. And this caused me to think a little bit. The various headings that they gave describing what's affecting our current expressions of community. One, this book says, is the pace of change. And we've talked about the technological change. We've talked about Offler's future shock, a form of culture shock as a result of time travel rather than space travel. The change in family. There's the increase in mobility. Do you remember in the 80s, great concern about third culture kids? Kids who weren't in their home culture, were not entirely in their host culture, and was out of the growing amount of third culture kids that the international school movement began to boom. And there was concern for these third culture kids. They were kind of viewed with pastoral anxiety. How do we help them? And now, third culture kids is something that's being celebrated. It's an entirely new culture. My wife and I moved to Japan to put our boys in the school in Nagoya that her father was one of the founders of. Because my wife had a vision to raise her children to be global citizens, and she felt, despite them being born in England and their parents being Canadian, she wanted to raise them in the international school in Japan. And as a result, my adult son's friends are now global. They are at home anywhere in the world. This Dictionary of Christian Ethics also cites materialism has an influence upon redefining what our understanding of community is. Materialism emphasizes privacy. I own something you don't. It belongs to me. It puts an emphasis on the individual. Then there's the use of time. And that's an expression of our current changes in our view of community. But also this, what caught my attention was this physical space. And they were particularly talking, this book was written about 25, 30 years ago, about how architecture and where people spend their time and their lives, both social and professional, how those spaces affect our sense of community. Well, we now have a new kind of architecture. The writers of code or the new literature giants of the 21st century. We have cyberspace as a place where many people spend their time, and where my wife feels I spend far too much time. So these are all contributory factors. So going back to Goldman's quote, we are all wired to be connected. But as I reflected this week on the conference theme, I thought, well, I'm not so concerned about connectedness. That helps with efficiency. It helps with the transmission of information. But connectedness is about protocols, about rules, about algorithms, about the way that we kind of contractually agree. And we all know when you download an app, you have to agree to terms and conditions. Nobody ever reads those terms and conditions. But that's what connectedness does. It brings us into the environment of a defined relationship based on I give this and they give that. But community is not that defined. And I'm much more interested in what community is, because community requires values. No matter what our faith tradition may be, the faiths of the world emphasize community, of belonging to other people. So, is it good or bad? Well, of course, we all know that social media can be both. It all depends in whose hands the technology is and what values undergird. We've all seen social media used destructively. We've seen that in the press and through perhaps personal experience. We've also seen it how it can be used productively. My 84-year-old mother, we cajoled into getting a computer 10 years ago. She has 1,000 Facebook friends. They hang on her every word. She's now going into assisted care as of June 1st. She's becoming less mobile. She's a world traveler. 2 years ago, in 1 year, she was in El Salvador, Alaska, Japan, England, Uganda, and Kenya. She's now traveling less because of knee problems. But Facebook allows her the opportunity to interact with all the friends that she's made around the world. One of my adult sons, who's a filmmaker now and deep into all of this stuff, got really ticked off at me at Christmas time. Because for my grandson, Eli, here, 17 months old, living in Tokyo, Filipino passport, Filipino mother, Canadian father, I bought Eli a mini iPad. Now my reason was that his parents don't like books. And they weren't reading books to him. And we all know the importance of reading to children in terms of their development. So I thought, okay, I'll get them something they will use, and a mini iPad. Well, his uncle, my other son, Mackenzie, got very ticked off at me because he reminded me I didn't allow him a computer till he was 12 years old. But to see Eli adept at swiping and choosing the game he wants to play and what book he wants to read, and there's this app called Tom where you speak your voice, it records it, and then sends it back to you. And that's what he's doing in this particular picture, which was taken just 3 years ago. By the way, I now know what my father meant when he said to me, if I knew how great grandkids were, I would have had them first. Because an iPad is perhaps the new candy. Grandparents can buy their kids candy. But is it good or bad? It's both. It's the values that undergird our use of technology, I believe, and it depends on us.